Teshidale, hello everyone.
Teshidale.
Good to see you all. It was nice to see the sunlight coming into your room. But last night for Dawa and me, and this evening, or I guess yesterday morning for you. So you don't need to translate that. Okay, so what we'll be doing today is starting to introduce a little bit of data science.
다 Tsering also karing motor chigin sena tangto tam dewa yuchugi tsari chigorwa tiko this chig motor yes.
And in particular, we're going to introduce how to visualize data through graphs.
That happer to also get tangto de any chikar sugreta remove lamla kanda roach thank you basgor visualize and to make it tonon like chai yuchu. This whole thing to theory la babji de Mugatway Chukandazugo Meticolomutri, yes.
What does it mean when certain variables are related to each other? What's referred to as a correlation?
That take up say uncle Jutan Kashing, Jutan Jitri Kashirwa, Hansulaya, Dodu, Kuning Parla, Dodu Sistamala Karisungure, say, I think Desijagins, and the take up so could draw thing as with 2 days, I think Desijagres.
And then the idea of causation. And to what extent can we truly establish causality in science?
That's the Kalana Jutan Dribig Namshachi or what do you call it? Yes, that take up saying Bana Tsenjiki, Takshilatin de day, Jutan Dribig, Javate, and you could take a search for the chat Chris at that, yes.
And in our discussion of causation, we'd love to have a conversation about the similarities and differences between a Buddhist perspective and a scientific perspective on causation.
And then also the Jindrig Nam Shati, the Shijabi Kapsa, and then non-sweet on Tsering Parolaya, and it Tumbi Chatam, and Tumbi Chakari, Metelaya, and to the Jains.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So again, the first thing that we want to do is start to discuss how to visualize data, because visualizing your data is a really important aspect of science.
Tamputing also correct against system like trying to year but data, and make it Honam Laya, they remove Galaya, kind of spagure, say, they are what chickens, and it's Henry Drippy up such a Tanto de and it's remove Lamla page, PUBG, make it higher to Zuachora. Now
you can visualize your data both for multiple reasons.
One
goal can be for you to better understand your data and make sense of the quality of the data and how reliable they are for the goals of your study.
That's Chigari system, Balaya, Tigi, Dako Johnson, Migi, Chidikaris, Cherangi, Tranto Karichi, Yobate, and Gotoya Pulache, and it Delaya, and it could draw Canada which you do Madota, and a Susugi Tranto, the Richi Shajute, and you go Casugreta. Ichichi Chuparema research or I think it's head to the Chiti Mugichiti.
And another goal of graphs and data visualization is to present the results of your study to other people so that they can learn from what you've discovered.
Shenda Chikarmugi, Shenda Chikaresana, and the Cherangi, Taxation Jichuatela Tenide, Trimdichi Termbatera, and the Turigalaya. Papa in by night, me senda like Desija, me senda get from the taxation Juji Karichi Yendu Sete, Nikoto Sagitris.
So you could think of these graphs that we'll be discussing as an effective way of summarizing your data, because it wouldn't be very useful to just show the reader a spreadsheet with all of your data points.
The Chikari system Balaya. And Tanda La Pabiachi or data showing the taxation J. Trim data or trim data, Hamag trim data, 아니 되게 지 인든 도도티 무 청고요 바지레스 테마토페 게티 저런 게미 로네치라야 저런 그 장투고 리무나나 옆에 그 장투 리무 되나도 지 템바임바나 고티게 가스브르다 지 모스도 보고는 릴하고간에 디슈자트 그마레스.
Now, some of this may be new to some of you, and some of it may be review.
다다다 되게 그르게 비층 가시지 셔요 주데 지체나야 가실라야 지금 사와도 찬도 거레스 가실라임바이나 뭐마싱그 지 저종 찬도 거레스.
But we just want to make sure everyone has a foundational understanding.
다 조데 참말라야 지금 망식이 시샤 지금 용하게 제던 배치지였어.
So the first graph that we're going to discuss is the pie chart.
다 담보 들으가서 가리 모터치인세나 코르스에티 모터치인스.
And a pie chart is frequently used to summarize descriptive data.
다 저당에 바이나 가서기 코르스에티와 데주지에게 장토 되는로 차이치도 그저던 그래서
So you may have multiple categories in your descriptive data, and in a pie chart, each slice of the pie corresponds to each one of those categories.
다 저런 게 지금 장토 되게 나라야 그 딘슨 제라바 만도 가시가시요 바지 어떻게 도스가 저 코르나라 때는 스tambalaya 코르시 되게 접착이 차시레레 되게 아니 바조들라야 장토 그냥 딘슨 만도 요와 어떻게 딱게 뭐도 청구요레스.
So here is an example of a pie chart from the data collected from the summer research workshop.
단데 가르에서는 가서 약하게 진지게 sab중 치대요와 어떻게 값을 아니 장토 들을지 위에 장토 치요와 어떻게 되는데 돈조 샤주 고르지레스.
Nicole, maybe actually don't translate. Maybe I copied this, changed this at the last minute. So maybe this is from this current data. But doesn't matter. So this question reads, during the past 2 weeks, how many nights have you had a hard time falling asleep?
다 저대가라는 대상권이랑라야 고모니 쿠야 칼리 카보중하게 참고 같이 정성사야 되레스.
Now, typically a pie chart will summarize what's called a proportion.
다 저게 바이나 단단한 수코르시 되게 저대가라나 거기다 딘스만도 구조 바로 그 들세지고로 지중 그 들세지고로 뒤청그레스.
And a proportion corresponds to how much out of 100 does that particular category summarize, or how much does that particular category represent?
다 들세세 되게 되게 값을 가르에서나 단다게 딘슨 체라바 때라야 아니 자체 자기나니 자체 같이 쓴거도 세지고로 어떻게 청구요레스.
So if this whole pie here reflects 100, we can see that 86.4%, so a large percentage of the people did not have a hard time falling asleep.
단다 되게로 고 고리에 되게 강 차차에 반에 자체 단다 되가서 반에 자체 자트사 시에 그래서도서나 저 고모 뉴크야 칼레카보 좀 마선세티 지기도 스티스tam바 페치오가 고모 페치오라야 고모 뉴크야 칼레카보 좀 두스.
But about 13% of individuals had a difficult time falling asleep on a few of the nights.
다 자체 주순사 투스라야 아니 정말 가시지라야 아니 고 뉴크야 디스칼리 카보 좀에 통되는 정샤스.
So again, this is a way of summarizing how out of 100%, what number of people did or did not have a hard time falling asleep.
다다다 디가라나 가수가 가수다미 가수치라 자차 가수치라야 본다 뉴크야게 아니 지금 칼리 카보 정도 정도 세대 아니 자차 뭐라야 동야 따답디고 보니 동야 비슷한지레스.
But this doesn't mean that we have 100 people in our study.
다단데 되게 가르친 거 말했으나 가수 특시 심직되나라야 미 자요바 청구요 말했어.
We can see that we have 22 people who completed this particular question.
다단다 가수 데라 가르 통고도 세나 단다기 믹세기 데데 고 가르스브레 데라야 렌자니 데렌 주시나니 미 뉴스타니 도아스 렌자니.
So this suggests that maybe 3 or so people had a hard time falling asleep on 3 to 5 nights.
다다다 데나네 미 뉴스타니가네 미 숨잠슬라야 공다 아니 고모 샤마 숨링가라야 진니고야 칼레카보 정하기네 던데 정샤스.
and that the other remaining 18 or 19 people didn't.
Ta senda lama chora mi joji chugu chora kusula ya niti chomdus kali kapu chomdus nipya.
Now, you don't just have to have two categories in a pie chart. Sometimes you may have more than two categories.
Ta ngatsuge de correct tribu kapsi bana correct na public kapsi chetsula chiga mando ge dinsen ni gwa tena do yo maris kashila yemana dinsen pe mambu tena yores.
So this question asks, during the past 2 weeks, how many days did you sleep at some point during the day?
Ta da de to de kar na de visan kunyi girin la ya ani ching nima ko ni khuya chora nima ko ni thong khuya de ani tena do khuju khupe gi nima ka chu chong sa to adres.
Again, now we have ourselves a pie.
The
complete pie reflects the number 100, like 100%. And people had options to say 0 to 2 days, 3 to 5 days, 6 to 10 days, and so on in their response.
Hanta dada dila ya kuso len jabi kapse len jaya la ya ko damka mason damka dela ya ne nima lekone ni pat chonson sumne nga tugni chuse ti ko damka mabu yores.
And here we can see that most of the people or the largest percentage of people are taking a nap almost every day.
Hanta jacha gi dusta baina jacha gi chishu dro ta jacha chishu dege. This
doesn't mean that 36 people took a nap. It means that 36% of the 22 respondents.
That the minus standing lanja or minus standing lam len japju dig non ejaction so to any Nimatopando and Yukushas.
I don't have a calculator, but maybe that's around 7 people.
That the Kodus Chajadus Kosuro Chijava and Rapsicho better midun stress.
And then you can see the remaining percentage of people either took a nap 6 to 10 days per week, a smaller group 3 to 5, and then, and 18% took a nap 0 days, 0 to 2.
That dus gender by banner me Karsa Nima Tugni Julaya, ni Kuye, Judges Sochita J, Nima Smingala, yes, Juxum Satuche, and you go Nima Lekon in Nipata Delaya, Nijacha Jujitsanistwa on Tiris.
So a pie chart can be a very efficient and effective way of summarizing descriptive data from your projects. For example, what percentage of people are monastics, what percentage of people are male or female, or various types of questions. Another type of graph that's often used for descriptive data is a histogram. A histogram uses bars as its displays as opposed to the pie.
The histogram said Dignalaya Natsuge Tigersa pie said that Gorip Jurwa, Kotichu Tipetangamaris, Koriti Petangamaris, Tichelaya Natsuga to Narmut and a narrative in the Rot in the Petangris.
So here's an example of a histogram from some of the data collected from one of the surveys that says, on average, how many minutes did you sleep each time you slept during the past day? Please provide a number.
karma kasu chungo ma go te la ya ane chi tanga chi ro chi sa gi pisun ti yores to ati res.
And this corresponds to the duration of the naps that were taken during the day.
Na ha ta da de kari chong go re se na ro ane ko ning ko ni thong thong khu ba na ni jun rong lo khu ya se te gi chu go rong chu tin ju ro wa ti chong go res.
Histograms are really good for summarizing what are called continuous data.
Ta de kar sa nga so ge histogram sa de kar sa nursery na pa ba gi thirich to wa de ba na ne nga so ge tang tu yo pa kan shi la ya tang tu te mun je ra met te jun tu yo ju ge tang tu te da do ji chomber ji la pengres.
So a categorical data would be, are you a monk or are you not a monk, or are you male or female?
Ta da de la ya categorical data like the categorical na nga so ge dinsen sa ko ra dinsen ge tang tu te ba na khangila ya tabi ore se na ne chorong kar su re Tatsun chi yimbe membe tawa chi yimbe membe pu chi yimbe membe sa chi korwa ti ba na nga su dinsen ge tang tu chi korwa ti ne pechu tang res.
A continuous variable involves a range, and here the range is from 0 to 105 minutes.
Ta da de ka su continuous variables ba ti nga su continuous variables na di 지금 무트비 준트비기 다 저치칭 바이나 저탕칭 바이나 되게 가르 성거에서나 지 잠깐 되는 데버트 인사 지거로 고 잡생이 진짜 성거에 스피차샤는 바이나 되네 아니고 कर्मा로 알레코네 자탕아 바로티 잡세 지거로 또 성거레스.
And then we divide the range up into what are called classes. So here is 0 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and so on.
Dati nga so ge ji ya tangka te ge chapse te la ko ne ja tanga re te yimba ka shla te ta ya nga so kari chi gre sana te yang ko ge chapse ge dinsen la ya class ge dinsen chu 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 go sha ja gre sta de ka se ba na la ko ne ni sta nga che ne te ne nga chu che te ne dun sta nga che te ne ja nga tu ya che sha res.
How we define the classes is somewhat arbitrary. We've made the decision here to classify it into these 25-point bins because we thought that would be an effective way to summarize the data.
Nga so ge dinsen la istambala ya la ko ne ni sta nga part kari in istambala ya di damya ge jinsen de ro ani ko chi kar so ta kap la ya shi sha de ta dam ji de do res ta de dam ge jinsen kar se na nga so ge tan da tang thu de ta hep kap so de la ya Ishi tis nambalaya kuke dinsen ti nyustanga lo gosha japa imbana ku desha jala pent kudu samchi ane du sam shabjitina chiyes.
Now, one of the kind of foundations of graphs and data science is understanding a vertical versus horizontal axis.
Tanda nga suge tiri tanga yana tangtu ge tsang ri chi korwa de nang ni ji mang ji ge xie xia chi kar re se sta wala che chu kar ngi gu re se na ani nga chu ge y gi thi ti ta x gi thi ti se do ta de ka se ba nga chu ge jong thi te ta ani che thi te ka ri ba ting gu res.
So here our first variable, which is the number of minutes that a person slept during the day, is represented on the horizontal axis right here, and this is often referred to as the x-axis.
Ta tanda de kapsa nga so ge jutang chi ge jutang de kala na mi ti ning ko ni ku bi kapsa ni jero lo khusha se ge karma ge tin chi ro te ani dus jutang te dus de kapsa ban x-axis ka so yores x ka so yore de nga so ge karsana de kapsa de thethi ro thethi te ga la so yores.
And the number of people, our second variable, is reflected on what's called the vertical axis or the y-axis.
That shenda nga so gen jutang juchi shenda ni ba chi gore de ka res na de kapsa ani ko mi ka chu ge len ja sha sa chi gore mi gi khatang de ani de kapsa ba na nga so ge y gi thi tang ya na nga so ge de gi jong thi chi gore wa te kan chom ba chi gores.
Now, in a histogram, it often is summarizing frequencies. So how frequent is a particular observation? In this case, a 0 to 25 or 25 to 50 minute nap.
Ta tanda de kapsa nga so ge nursery de pech tang histogram san de pech tang ge kapsa ba na kar so gore ta 되게 바로 될라 정하기 지금 다 종로의 탄탄색으로 왔다 타마가서 정샤색으로 왔다 되가서 뒤쪽에 세트를 시작했어. 이제 샤나 가서 이제 뉴스등간에 가서 받아가서 정샤세 되게 저도 가서 지금도 색으로 왔다. 되게 세트 첨부지 그랬어.
And histogram, or in a histogram or a bar graph, as we'll talk about, the greater frequencies have taller bars.
그래서 나 단단한 속에 에너지 유사기 디르도 나라야와 가리 총그레스나 거기 다 뒤셔서 그러다 때나 양시양시게 절대 지역에 체 망바요 바이나 아니가 속은 에너지도 주신 너무지 용도도 되게 랭세된 투어요레스.
So here we can see about 11 people, the tallest bar, 11 people slept between 25 and 50 minutes when they slept during the day.
한다 단단히 가서 가서도 스타바 인바이나로와 가만히 있다가는 같이 버트 니쿠니로와다 니쿠니 인바나 미 죽지도와 죽지 스tambalaya 단다 되게 나네고 지금 트 너무 지거라 그 너르지도와 주진 너무 되게 나네고 도시 오바강실에 되게 아니고 다 바로 될라야 주시진이 나네 망시티 네 가만히 있다가는 같이 버트 니쿠한테 청거레스.
And here you can see 3 people, because this is 0 to 25 minutes is this bar, and then the number of people goes from 12 to 0, and we're right between 4 and 2 here, so 3 people slept 0 to 25 minutes.
karma lekoni nyustanga parta nyukni mi sum dos tabai bana gasoge te jon thetik galaya karma gasongo bache jon tik galaya gasu mi gasu chi yo metirwa tabai na lekoni chuni parta do danda te la ya kama lekoni nyustanga parta nyukni te ni ton shinyu paro de la do sta mi sum te kama lekoni nyustanga parta nyukushas.
So a histogram is a really nice way of summarizing the frequency of observations when you have 2 variables like this, say number of people and minutes.
Tadanda de kasanga so nerjiora narmugna koya nerjiora de karila pen kari chayala yapu yoresena chela karsugunita naturally juchitan jutomando ani chero de kapsimbana migi khatanta karmakasani kushasa chigoro jutomando ani yopi kapsa ko chayala ya lila yore chay chet pechetana ya yore de kapsimbana ko tendanda uge ni tang sakorada jutan ni chat swembege 아니 그게 잠깐때 단가서 가리 주ton 니차 천비게 되셔서도 아다 frequency 선어와 탐망로 정샤세티 내가 순내를 같은 천버지그레스.
Now, because a histogram typically summarizes continuous data, meaning like here from 0 to 105, you often don't have spaces between the bars.
다단다디 히스토그램스 디카스 바나로와 아니 시적이나 가서게 거기다 문제게 장토치 청구 예자 근데 내라야 그 너시들도 요바나 너시들도 어디 어디다가 바로라야 아니 그디요 말이스 가사 파톤요 말이스.
A bar graph is typically used when you have categories and you want to summarize the data from categories as opposed to a continuous variable.
Tanda de kasim de tan narjila so bar graphs de narjiting asu karila pechi tangresena ani de kapswa gamge de la yang atsula ya ko ge tangtu de ani juntu pi tangtu do de la ya juntu pi tangtu mai ba chen de la ya zu karesena asu ge dinchen gi tangtu chorwa tiopikas ani ko narjisa de pechi tang bar graph pechi tangres.
So like a histogram, the higher the bar, typically the higher the number or the observation for that particular variable.
Histogram ani ku traditional mudegi to se te ka su to yo ba bana ani de ti kap tarang la ya ani ku kar su re che to yo de shu ma yo pa ta ya na ku ge kar su ta tap shi ti ma yo pa song res.
The main difference though is that bar graphs are usually used to summarize data on categories, whereas histograms are used to summarize data that are more continuous on one variable.
Tadanga suga narita histogram sa te ni chagi chapter do chi 지바이나 조카레스나 단다기 나르시디 bar graph 데로와 나르시디 가서 카릴라 페치던 그래서나 딘친 유튜브기 당토티나로 첨버지라야 페치던 그래 아니 셴다기 히스토그램스에게 연코데 카릴라 페치던 그래서나 당토티 준토피기 당토치 요바데 아니 고 트리간라 첨비 값 히스토그램스에 페치던 그래서.
So this is just a kind of a fake bar graph, but just for teaching purposes, in which you can imagine, like many of your research projects, you have two groups of people. You have one group of people going through a particular training, or maybe doing meditation before they go to bed. And then you have another group of people that are serving as a comparison group.
그 단단선 트랙 그 도주 지사 주진스와 디컵셈바나 조카레스나 지대처럼 게다 지금 냠는 지고 바나 검 냠는 지고 그노 딘센 지당니 셴다데 거 냠는 지와데 아니 파 들사게 딘센 지고요로 델라에 딘센이요레스.
So here we have imaginary data on a group of people who went through a compassion training program. And here we have imaginary data on a group of people who served as a comparison group.
다다게 델라야 가서 선발지가 당토데 도주가 당토지 문이 많이 지르와 도주 조주지 아니 델라야 딘센치카르스나 안용지기 검지니기 딘센치 그거기 당토지다 아니 저저데 데tam파 둘사게 딘센치 그거기 당토예스.
And you can tell it's a bar graph because we have space here between the groups. Whereas a histogram, you often don't have any space between the bars because you're summarizing a continuous variable as opposed to a categorical variable.
다단데 값에 dus lamson tawatan de chesuga energy ro tada the bar graph imba chongres hakugres karchila baina ani de 값에 kogi tatusin narmochi do ade kalaya de narmo nanate ni shag parola tomba do waswa niketinga histogram imba na paro tomba to yomares.
And we can imagine that we would have administered a self-report questionnaire that measures people's well-being or happiness after the compassion training program.
milaya sususugi karsugurata ditap susugi detantan rawa yuchu droatina do susungune pankore nai jayo yuchu tinda do yuchu kola samtana digres.
So on the x-axis, this horizontal axis, we have two groups, compassion training and comparison group.
Tatanda nga su x te ta yana dandage thethi te ganglaya nga su dinsen yores dinsen chi kare na ani ninji gomre chinu dinsen te ta ani ninji ko dursagi dinsen chi dinsen yores.
And then on the vertical axis or the y-axis, we have well-being, self-reported well-being from some questionnaire that they might have completed.
Tan de nga su ge ko jontik ganglaya ro y te gangla kare yores na ani nga su ge detap tan reo ju ko la ya susu ngone phang ko len je chu ge chi or wa da je shi ge draw te la ten de ta ni ja she sha ju ge wa tin do chi ani ti ta chya ti ka la na nga su ge detap sa ti chong ko res ti yang ko susu ge len je ba te la ten de ta chong wi chim de.
And higher scores on this y-axis correspond to greater self-reported well-being on this questionnaire.
Tata de ka su nga su ge jontik ge gang la ya tangka ka su ge cho yo pa ba na su su ngo ne chi din thang tan do yo chu te la len ja bi ge ni tsi ti ka sa ani chi ge ka su ta din thang ga che thua yo pa chong ge res.
And what we can see in our imaginary data set is that the people who went through a compassion training program had better well-being than those individuals who did not.
Tata de ka su nga su ndusta ba na de nga su tozo ge tang ton de la ta ba na ro tang ton de na ne ani sham nyang ji go gomre chi ne de ani ko gonde ma chi yu ge te ko dursa ge din chi tan te ba na ne ko so la ya ji din tang ge ne ya go yo pa chon dus.
And as we'll talk about later, experiments like this are really effective in science for creating causality.
Tata data wo ge ta che de ro data wo ge ta che de ani Tsering na ne ani nga so jutan do ge chi do ga chi ro ti che te ani ko pen to po tan ke chim bu ba te ani je le de shi yes.
Because given that we have a comparison group who did not go through the training and a compassion training group, we can presumably say that it's the compassion training group that drove the increased well-being, because we have a comparison group of people who did not go through that training.
Ko karsana nga suga dintang sete ku yar peshas peti karichinere sena ani ningji te gondru chola tenere esti jinu go jinsen karechila baina ko ningji sete gondru chola tene ko su dita yago chonsha sigdus jenda manda te go ga dursagi dinsen chkorwa tela ya ko ge dintang ge number ya pemendus.
So here's an example of a bar graph from the talk I gave on the neuroscience of emotion.
Honta danda dela ya ni tamshi ji ji danda nga su samyong tendo ju tamshi ji ju te tanda yo ni na riching dos chamber ji sha yes.
So what we did in this study, or not we, this is a colleague of mine, what my colleague did in this study is she identified people who were struggling with a serious depression episode, a depressive episode.
Ta danda de ngarang leto chiki toxic ji sha ju res ta de zu de karila ta yo res na ani karso gure da nga su depression sana ta yeshin ba su gure da sam shim ba ge nitan tenden da ta yo ju ge mete ta la ya toxic ji de res.
And then she found a separate group of people who were not depressed.
Ta de le ne shenda yang ko din san ro din san shenda chi la ya toxic ji jenda de la ya ani ko yeshin ba no san shim ba ge nitan me ju ge din san che toxic ji res.
And then she had them go into an MRI machine and scan their brain.
Da kuzo de persanga tsuga let's ge lonje ge yuchi sto tigna tele ta ani ko de let's lonje masta de kars MRI yorwa o tigna tele tigna ta ni ko ge lepa tinga tsuga khablen yende parles goro tigna ta de ta ani lepa ti par jayores.
And she looked at activation in the ventral striatum of the brain.
Da de per jab chi karila tayore sana nga su dungil tension na la ya ani lepi ge chegu kana ro chi du se te la ya tayores.
And then she was able to plot these data with a bar graph.
Da tu tenu je la ya tanda ge tang thokar yo pa te ani narjig na tu dus phap theories.
And so would anyone in the group like to summarize the findings of the study from this bar graph?
Ta dus ta ba imbana ro che chu ge nane tanda ta ko ge shimjig te ge ko ge nyinton do do te tanda de la ya narshi dina ko sha yo ro de na la kari ko ndu te de sha ja yes.
And no worries if you don't. I'm kind of throwing you on the spot.
Ashina che. Oh. That's all.
I can summarize it.
Yes.
We're still new to figures. I'll go ahead and just tell Pasang La, I'll summarize it.
That's all.
So let me summarize it for you, and then we can.
There's one.
Oh, there is one. Okay, great.
Hello.
Oh.
Hello.
Just delay.
Any the Tamudela Dirishara graph singing the any Tangdo Disha Chichadi restaurant. Any Chida any graph de la Kamindo among Boyore Dinalone Zozo de la any Tambudela Pai Church, any newer histogram che, Sumbadela any bar graph lache, graph Kamidawa, Toda any Tangdo Dudangi, Rimba Kamido Sumsio Resra. any pie chart do somebody na tanda di tigre tanda kharsa gore gyaja na lo ne gyaja gyana lo ne any gyaja khaju gi dinde chungyu me chora dinde rik che shi che di any pie chart na lo do sin thyoyong gores any niwa de la histogram di zo di kharchi gorsna thangdo ya due de la thangdo due imba khanshila thangdo due ti ani muthu ni do sin ni thangdo due yogi rik chi cha di gores dinde gi any thangdo gi summarize
yeah, chichina draw gumatsin sarwa draw te sa kala gorana gela gi draw te kala na de la ya chiten do digi shimji digi nyentu gi tondo dodo te degatele nar digi kwesha yorwa de la decision rochida sa he's trying to explain
I could
summaries of all the graphs and the variables.
I could pick that up and tell him I'm very grateful because I had a sense he's giving a great summary of everything we've talked about thus far. So tell him thank you.
Yes, Ratanda Gela Karisor system, but Tanda Partanga Deshi Japsha, Tirita, that Juchitanti, Korlaya, and a chicken, Nonton Dodo de Pay, watching the Shijap, you could sort the lessons and a cotton chase.
No, but I think that's great. I mean, I think the fact that we're going through all of doing a summary is great. The question here, though, is does somebody want to interpret this particular graph, this particular bar graph?
That under the Rangasu that histogram system, histograms at the Pila, and what the Tangi Temason. What the and I was trying to find the parent word for histogram and telling them I found it online and telling that we have a different term for that. That's DG and Tada and like draw the currents and dig shimji dig yentu de the laya narina question right that delaya and ecoge non toto the currents that it in the
And Dawa, given that this slide's in English, it may not work very well. So why don't I'll just do a summary of this slide, and we'll try to get some slides in Tibetan, and then we can have folks summarize. But just tell them that I'll do a summary of the slide. So what we have here is on the vertical axis or the y-axis, we have the brain data. We have the data from the ventral striatum. And then here we have people with major depression.
And in major depression
Here we have people with no history of depression. So these are people that are serving as our comparison group.
And
what you can see here is that the bar for people with depression is lower than the bar for people who don't have depression, suggesting that individuals with depression show reduced activation in this area of the brain.
And she got Mayopa to do us. Then they get carried on Goresena, Chiganatu Yishimbi, Nathan, you give me the Talasambina, who get a big chashin delaya, and it is Helonchia, Nibapti, Mauyo Pasonguis.
And so this is an effective way of summarizing the data across these two groups.
Now, that under the Binarwa, not to get Dinsen Mandon, de Nigi, Kola and Deshaja, Giroa, or they. Ani chicken deshajaton dodo gon the deshajala ani tandage dinner to becheton by natab do yoris.
And later we'll introduce perhaps the idea of what's an error bar, which is just to kind of allow us to determine how much confidence we have in our data. And
That,
these are these little error bars coming off the top here.
that shenda jinga su kare sena de la ya ni ko no trick se ta tsegi karsa gore da narisgro da tsegi tsena naris de ko la ya de shiji la jagi insro de karsana tanda nga su ge tushin mo te ga la ya ko ya tich do garwa kan da wala tich do ga this gore sta de ge kali song gore sena tanda ko su ge de la karsa tangtu chi gorwa tangtu de la ya ani chi ga dangso ka yo me ge cheti chong go res.
The main point that I want people to take away right here, though, is that a histogram is really good for summarizing how frequent a particular outcome is across some dimensional variable within a group of people. So I can say that again for you, Dawa. A histogram is good for summarizing how frequent a particular observation is within that group of people.
Tanda nga sugi degree search histogram search or data karila ya kangechi tsala ya yabu yores na dinsen chikinani ro dinsen chik dinsen ta mi ban tashi sa dinsen chikinani ani ko ta chapsing ichin chikinala ya ani thamanglo chungdu search or ti chomber chala ya ko yabu yores.
A bar graph is really good for summarizing an outcome between two groups of people or between two variables.
Tadandagi narrish or narriti kari nintun ti ya pancreasena and dinsemando and nig paro chaperti and dreado tang tit sombacha tayana asugin jutan sugrot and jutomando and nigi nitan tit sombacha ya pancreas.
So the next figure that we'll discuss is one of the most common figures used in all of science.
Tanda de la ya chilanga su desha jadi karin sena chitanga Tsering na la ya ni chi yongchab ga ne pechu ta ge ni tur chi pechu ta desha jagis.
And this is what's called a scatter plot.
That de la ka segres na thorri segres.
And a scatter plot represents the relationship between two variables.
Tanda ga thorri se de ge kari songres na ro nga su jirta mando ani ge paro ge jewa chi ro jewa te songres.
So you could think of the relationship between two variables as opposed to summarizing data across groups.
That de kapse chisu kare samlo tang de gre sena ro ko jirta ni ge paro ge jewa chomba chi la ya samlo tang go res ma to pe yang koran cha ge chi chantang kan ro chi re sa chi ro me la ya ani chi koran ge durse kan ro chi re sa sa do ge ne to ma bo do de na mai ba chi de kapse ba ne jirta ni paro ge jewa te chomba chi la pe chi tang res.
And usually the variables are what are called continuous, and I'll describe what that means.
Tanda de kapsa nga su jutong sa te tan juchi sa de kapsa zo de ani chi ga mendregi juntupi gi ani tangthu chi la ya gugu yo res ani tanda juntupi tangthu sa de kare imi chi tanda deshi jagins.
So categorical variables would be like a group 1, a group 2, or a group 3.
Ta yang nga su ga ta tangthu tang yang nan juchi tang yang nan jutong sa bi kapsa shenda chi nga su dinseng gi jutong tan juchi sa chi res ro. Dinsen la yo chi shayores dinsen tampo dinsen yo dinsen sumbas lu si yo grashayores.
A continuous variable is where you have a range of outcomes on one particular variable, for example, between 0 and 100.
Tashin tandage nga su ge karsu greta jun thupi ge juchi ban jutain ban na ko ga na ne ko chapse chitong go res pisha shana le ko ni jag part sa chi go te ga na ne katsu chungo patiten go res.
So an example of a continuous variable would be how many hours of meditation did you do yesterday?
Tanda nga tsu jun thupi gi juchi gi chi pinchen chi kare res na khesan chi jun rang lo lai chang go gondru chi me sa te ba na de kapsin juchi de ne ko jun thupi gi juchi jutang tang na juchi gi pinchen chi res.
An example of a categorical variable would be, did you meditate yesterday, yes or no?
Ta de dinseng ge jutang tan do pi to chi pisha sha ba na khesan chang go gom jab yimbe mes to ti res te la ya lente yin ta mes ko dinsen la yo chi len ja ko.
And so a scatter plot again examines the relationship between two variables.
Tanda nga tsu to shi te ge ro jutang ni ge paro ge jewa tin de shi ja res.
So let's say, again, here we have what's referred to as the horizontal or x-axis.
자 다다데 가서 데라야 징어서 체크 당야나 x 기티스그와
And this could be any continuous variable, the amount of hours spent in meditation, the amount of hours playing soccer, it's a range of possible outcomes.
다다데게 체크 데게고 주치던 주탄가리나 전에디고 스페셜샤나 네 임바가실고 준토픽인 주탄치 고고요라 진짜 다 진ren로라처럼 아니 건드지임베 야나 진ren로라처럼 아니 지금 컨셉폴로스임베서 저거와 거기 전에디 잡스기 지금 당가 찍니 찍벌도 준토픽이 당도 선거에 될라야 전에 거기 비춘 주통마스는 단단되는 로망보여스.
And higher numbers on this particular axis here correspond to higher values on that variable. So more hours of spent meditating or more hours playing soccer.
단단데 가서로 와가지고 탭틱 간라야 당가데 가서 지금 도와요 바이나 아니 거기 주탄되게 거기 지금 벌써 대한 전부요 통과를 스피셜에 득값이 전부요 바이나로 아니 가성거서는 조금 잡아이나 검짐 짐부 잡아 로치서 만부랑라 건잡았다 아니 컨셉폴로 제바임바나 컨셉폴로 지롱폴라 치서 만부랑라 컨셉폴로 지기요 받성거레스.
Now this axis here again is referred to as the vertical or y-axis.
단다 연소사게 될라야 가지고 y 기타야나 가지고 될라 정트스그레스.
And this would be a second variable. So for example, this may be how happy somebody is. So if somebody spends more time in meditation, maybe they're happier. Or in the soccer analogy, maybe the more time somebody plays soccer, the more goals they score. So again, this would be another variable reflected on this axis.
또 정택 놀아요 바테 양아 속은 주통던 주시신다 치선바치샤요 레스데라 가리오네 디코레 스피샤샤나 곰망부 잡세티 곰탄 텐데탄 양코 디치티 기푸도무도 사야기 지고 체시거와 어디서나 디코레 에나 샨다 양 컨셉폴로 저롱보세 마첼레텐데 그런 거 폴로 같이 줄tum도 사야시거와 어디세 제약체테 지네디코레 스틴스탄발라야 니코 정택 간라야 코 주통젠다 친도 아청고요레스.
So again, a scatter plot is a really nice way of summarizing the relationship between two variables.
그 도도 슈바이마이나 토리세 되게 아니 주탄탄야는 주체니가 바르기 제와데 아니 지금 덤버치알아야 아니 카스오고니 던트크요레스.
Now sometimes those two variables may have a positive association, that is, as one goes up, the other goes up.
참라야 저정때니게 바로라야 그런 게 가서 그랬다 가지고 댓글은 되어 텐데스 그러다 유지된다 요리스다 텐데 댓글은 되어서는 가서 그래서 지금 배바 인반에 현다딜라 배야지 거로 아니션 냠때야 배야지 거로 대용 거레스.
And this is, I'll define a correlation on the next slide. So right now we're just talking about associations.
다다데 가서 딘데세 디르와 딘데세디 니 제라이 데시자긴 스탄다 데라양 아주 딘데세디 마이마양 데왈라 쿠알레나드 코리스.
So if this is a positive association, what I could say is as variable A goes up, variable B goes up as well.
다단데게 거기 지금 댓글게 조요 줄에 시스템발라 카스고레스는 아주 주트란치고로 아티 에티 마운트 루바이나 양 주트란 비티양 마운트 루레스데스.
So as people spend more time in meditation, their happiness will go up as well.
아니 가서 검자에게 주소만 바이나 그 디치처에게 니탄테야 마운드르레스데스.
Or as somebody practices soccer for longer amounts of time, they may score more goals, and that would reflect a positive association. Or football, I guess it would be not soccer, whatever, however you summarize.
Dai shenda kalana ngasu ke concept polo sia ra chiso ma se baina ti so pe ko polo liya ge chi karsubure tiya ma yores etida cha yores. Also we can go like if one of the variable decreases, the other one decreases. Also, this is a positive correlation, right?
Yes. So that would say the same thing. If you have low values on here, you will have low values on there. If you have high values on here, you have high values there.
Right, that they can send a package, Korean, Chinon Rubana, sent at the non Ruas at the Aqualayo, that they can send Panasuga to Tanto Chiki, touching Jutan Chiki Tanto to Toyo Pana, gender ticket onto Toyo, but Jutan Chiki Tanto the Mayo pickups, gender ticket Tangatian, Borsetia, Mayo is.
However, not all relationships in life have this positive association. Sometimes there's a negative association.
나서게 가서 지금 시간에 대화 만부치 콜라 지 테크스 그러다 테크가 더 요치된다도 다 텀비긴 더 요치된다도 positive senada 텀비긴 더 요치된다도 요 말이스 카시치라야 아니 그 도페 마텀비긴 더 요치된다 요레스.
So a negative association or correlation, as we'll describe later, says that as values on variable A go up, values on variable B go down.
단단데 가서 가지고 몇번 봤다에는 도피긴 되었다 도피기 뛴데서 도피되어서 뒤 값을 갈수 버려서나 가지고 주장로 A기 장가다 장벌티 치르도 바이나 아니 주장 B기 장가데 총드로야지 그러 컨버스티 총드로야스.
So you can see this graphically, these relationships are very different. So this is saying that as you have higher values on this variable, you have lower values on the other variable.
단단하게 가서게 델라 티르니도 와와 토르니도 대간에 아니 거기 지치니 차가 반승근 저와티도 스톤트교레스와 아니 단다 예쇼차게 델라 타바임바나 예쇼차게 델라 타바나 가서 카르탕도 세나로와 아니 that traffic gala youtube traffic gala youtube borsetti thor dugoro phandu dugoro thor rustambalaya ani jonthig la chonbege jonthig gala chonbege ani borsetti chon dugores.
Trying to think of an example of a negative correlation. Maybe you could ask if anyone in the audience can think of something that as one thing goes up, another thing goes down. So maybe like as you eat more bad food, your happiness goes down or something like that. You could see if anyone has a thought on what might be this negative association.
하다다다 델라야 지금 мет음베 기 되어요 지탄이나 지금 도페기 된대요서 디라로 페센트나로 지속이 나네 텐트게 되스 가서나 지 만드르 스탐발라야 셴다데 뇽드라치고라 피차샤나 마수기 사마그르 사만 두자그르 사바이나 아니 지 가서버다 디치탄 지 기부처야시고로 와티 뇽드라 다부기 페센트나로와 미치수 나네 단다게 도피긴 좋아요 주 도피기 된대요 주 밑은비 된대요 주게 비천티나로 트렌트게 돼서
랍상 hello
됐을래
인진라 표현하게
인진은
for example the longer you smoke and the shorter your life will be.
Perfect.
타마로 진롱부 통바에나 미시 티속이 진통도 그래서 비세.
The longer you smoke, the shorter your life will be. Absolutely. Any other examples of a negative association or correlation?
다른 것은 도피 밑은비 된대단도 지금 비슨 셴바된다 요에서.
맞어 냥지식 전본 조디가라 셔동식 초는 줘야다. 단지 자리가 나오지나 두쇼 토론 조디가라 두쇼 마른 조디가라 랍토 초는 줘요.
뭐래?
더 필요해 돼.
라서. Yeah, one example is if you practice more compassion or the positive emotions, your hatred of the negative afflictive emotions will go down. Also, like when we think about the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, what we know is if the frequency goes up, the wavelength goes down. So that is also a negative correlation. Yeah.
That's a great example. I'm dealing with experts. That's for sure. Both are wonderful examples. And yeah.
Oh, yes.
One more.
And the Dobby did pitching show middle down is somebody down, partially somebody near Dobby did.
Correct.
Let's see how I can say about na partially any maga somebody on your draggy. That you certain.
Uh-huh. From a single person, if like the feeling of love or feeling of hatred, they have negative correlation, because if you have like a feeling of love towards some person, you have most likely have less feeling of hatred towards that person. So that the two feelings or emotions have a negative correlation between them.
Beautiful. All just beautiful examples. So the last outcome that we'll often see is that there just are no associations between these two variables or between two variables. So that you can see here, there's no relationship between variable A and variable B. And the correlation or a scatter plot is very useful in depicting that type of outcome.
Tunde chune meju chigoro dewa chune meju ge netan tinado yores bichajane de kasimba na ngasuge juche tan yana jutang e tan jutang be ni paro la ya dewa chune meju chindus yores ta de kasimba na ngasuge thorji chigoro thorji te beju tan baina ani ko ge jutang e tan jutang be ni ge paro la ya dewa meju ge number te toya la ya ani thorji te beju tan baina pent pushu yores.
So this is a example of a correlation matrix that I presented in the topic on the neuroscience of emotion. And so these are real data from a study in which they took activation in the brain from the ventral striatum. They had people fill out a self-report measure on their psychological well-being, which is on the vertical axis.
And then they
And again, higher numbers here reflect higher ventral striatal activation. Go ahead.
Technical gala ya tangka katsu toyo by narrow, technical gala tangka katsu toyo by na de Carson Dunchigil Henshunga gala ya, and a kubi jegoti katsu mayo by the Songores.
Oops. And higher numbers here correspond with greater psychological well-being.
And Tandage Jontica gala ya tangka katsu toyo by Nangatsu Sankam Tan Devi, Dintanchi or they did so get toyo, but Yaoyo by Songores.
And as we can see here, as ventral striatal activation increases, you also see an increase in psychological well-being. So this would be a positive association or a positive correlation.
Della Tunsha Dustan, this Tambalayan, Dicares, and the Torshi Diganang Asolaya, Dewatayana, Tudede, and it Tumbigi, Dewatayana, Tumbigi to reach Tongdus.
Now, in this course, we'll introduce to you just a few statistics.
Tatandagangaso Subjon Diga Capsi in Banangasu with that Tatsisigro that Tangatse Yojugi, Anstanda Yojugi, Netonkashi Mutuji, yes.
One of which is a correlation coefficient, and I'll describe this in 2 slides.
But on the sticker, Sanangas are says what they get, Kotunjegi, and a Koge, Danton Sigua, or they and the Shijagins, did under the Jelaya, Mutujains.
But in brief, the correlation coefficient is a number that summarizes the relationship between these two variables.
단다가 가서는 주장도 야는 주장이 열어 주장도 주체니 열어 대 니차게 바로게 되어지고와 어디 아니 지금 돈 디우 거는 좀 버지그레스.
So scatter plots depict what are often referred to as a correlation.
다단다 가지고 더 리세 되게 집단이 바이나 아니 딘데세 때 좀 버지그레스.
And a correlation is a statistic that reports how related two variables are. And as we just, yeah, go ahead.
집단 가서 딘데세 때 가르스나 지금 저쪽만로 이거 바로라야 다츠기 무간에 아니 지금 저 가르친도 세때 좀 버지그레스.
Now, the correlation statistic actually is the same logic as we just discussed in the scatter plot.
단단 가서 되게 가서 그래다 된데게 다츠세 지고라 된데게 다츠세 되게 고던데 가서는 단단 가서 강라에 더를 벌시 당데 당데 당진데 시자송 대치 버치정레스.
So like a scatter plot where we saw a positive association, a positive correlation means that as one variable increases, so does the other.
단단 가서 더를 강내와 고 대화티 아니 지 틈비긴 대화 지권데 시자송 어디 당 총비 강내와 단데 값이야 딘데세 때 틈비기 딘데세 스탄발에 가리스고레스나 지금 저정치 야로바는 저정 젠다티야 저정치 패와임바는 저정 젠다치야 패그레세 니탄 송고레스.
And a negative correlation means that as one variable increases, the other goes down.
아니 가서라 도피기 딘데세 비 값을 가리스고레스나 아니 지금 저치 야 패바이나 저치 젠다티 뇽도 두고 송고레스.
Now this is identical to what we just discussed with the scatter plots.
단데 가리 땅 송고레스나 단계 뉘랑가 주 더르지 배치 땅데 땅데 시자송 때땅 지버치정레스.
But here, instead of summarizing it using a graph, we're going to summarize it using a number.
단데 네가 값인 바이나로 가서게 지고게 제와티 지 돈 디부건이 쳐야라야 뒤를 배치만 동안째 아니 딜라야 가리 배치던 그랬으니 정가지 배치던 그랬어.
And the number is what's referred to as a correlation coefficient.
다 딜라야 가서나 거기 정가 딜라야 가지고 딘데게 천장식 그랬어.
So the correlation coefficient again is just a number that kind of summarizes the same thing that we just discussed using those figures, the scatter plots.
다단데 딘데게 천장식으로 장가 되게 가르쳐 그랬으나 이해 가서 뭐라야 지금 토를 배치당도 그 저와지 선배치송아 어디디 지버치신 네고 장가 나라야 밥데던 선배치 그랬어.
And here a -1 would be relate to a negative correlation. So as one variable goes up, the other goes down.
다단데 가서 그때 그거 장가때 딘데게 천장때 도마식인 바이나 가르쳐 그랬으나 가서게 도피기 딘데 총거레스 도피기 딘데 가르쳐 그랬으나 지야 패바이마나 젠다티 뇽도 두고 받son 거레스.
Actually, just 1 second, Dawa.
Sure.
I want to just kind of show this visually. Okay, so I just think this will be better if they can see it visually.
Sure. And then we get
Okay. So basically a correlation coefficient and the scatter plots are saying the same thing. A correlation coefficient is using a number and the scatter plot is using a visual graph.
더지 배치 당바당 아니 가서 딘데 센터 배치 당데도 선바치와 대치던 건 넘던 시바치 전송거레스 더리 마이나 가서 그 퓨지 리무 배치 당데도 선바치고로 안 대화들와 이는 단다게 아니 가서 딘데기 전장대기 연구 등가지 배치 당데도 코니 바로 그 대화도 선바치고레스.
And the correlation coefficient ranges between -1 and 1.
다 단다게 딘데기 전장대 그게 잡세대 같으래서는 녹마식는 음마식이 바로 뒤쳐버렸어.
So a correlation coefficient of 1 means that there's a perfectly positive relationship between those two variables. As one goes up, the other goes up perfectly.
That Masuga Tundeg Santanti getting we must see by na, Tangaschi by na, take a Karsongo system by line, Jutrantin Check Parolaya, and you call Karsugre, the Tumbig Tunde Tata, your patch songuris, Karit love your resena, Jutrans Chia, pay by Bannon, Jutrans and that, Stipachi for Pegres at the songuris.
So this scatter plot would have a very close to perfect relationship, but it's not totally perfect because you can see that some of the cases here spread out a little bit. So maybe this correlation coefficient would be, 0.8 or something like that.
아니 딘드가 전정대 지 다다지르면도 스와 가실라 바나 코게 다티 차차여 주된 고 다다지되면도 지 야마지 담지로 오시도 와라 니스탄발라야 데카스 패치 코게 지 딘드가 전정대 아니 레코드 사제타우 인서레스.
This is a pretty negative association. So this correlation coefficient is going to be closer to -1.
Tanda dekare system balanga suge dopigi tunde changdo dopigi tunde de changstambala dege ane tunde ge changdero ane dogmatic tan niwayo res.
And you can see it's not a perfect relationship because not all of the dots are just right, perfectly. There's some spread here, but it's still a pretty strong negative relationship.
Tanda dekapse yanko ko dopigi tunde choro ten tata chi yan membande chechu dusta baina thitizo chatizo ta baina tongdo ko tata tiga chigala pamendo yan ko tamde do membana dekapse ngaso dopigi tunde chi shuchenbo yimba chantko res.
And so maybe this value here on a correlation coefficient would be like -0.7 or something.
Tata dusta baina de ngaso tunde ki chantangala ba baina dogma record sodun ta uchinsares.
Now, if there's no relationship, like in this particular scatter plot, then the value of the correlation coefficient is going to be close to 0.
Tanda data warwa ko parola ya shoni tude tan jochun mejugi ani third grade ochin baina dig kapsu ngasu tunde ki chantangte record tan yoyo res.
So again, a strong relationship would have a +1 if it's positive. A strong relationship would have a -1 if it's a negative relationship. And if there's no association between two variables, it's going to be close to 0.
Ta getting asula ya chi tunde chigoro tunde de tumbi tunde shi choyo baina ko ge tunde chantang te chi ta tanyoje ani dopi tunde shi choyo baina ko ge tunde chantang te ani dogma chi ta tanyoyo baje. 아니 게트 코로니 바로라이안 드라메 바틴데 메바드레 도임바나 코게 틴데 센탄테 레코르탄요 이레스.
And the last figure that I'll show is something that you may use in your research projects, and this is referred to as a time series plot.
다 현대치가에서는 가서 제주가 닥시 심직나한테 배치단도 거래스. 네 가서 가래서는 코게 티르데양 가서 Tigi Ditulatin or Tiginolaya, Tilatin tripping through the Nagiris.
And this is a figure that's very useful when you have multiple observations on the same people over time.
That Dick Catula Pengres and a Katie Chorangi me, Taxi Simji Chisa me, Chick Ganlaya, and you call that Lu Mambo Ranlaya, Tashi Tama Mambola Jebaina. 아니 단다게 거기 뒤기 뒤쪽이 아니 뒤르지 페이지도 뒤던데비 뒤르디게 아니 슈 전투야라야 기펜첨부 요레스.
So let's say you're in your research project, you're having somebody do 4 or 3 days of drinking caffeine, and then you want to assess their sleep every one of those days.
Take picture shabaina or charange michila any cooler caffeine or other coffee on a caffeine zeti tongu tonu jela that don't touch in on a yamashi sumshicilaya tongu don't be in yamate takanalaya ni meti a nigokola tossing between you tuna.
You'll want to plot their scores on whatever your outcome measure is. Maybe it's number of hours slept on for each of those days, let's say here we had 9 days, you could plot across all 9 days, and that would be a good way of summarizing or depicting the effect of that caffeine use over time on people in your study.
다 비샤샤 바이나로 텔라텔레데 단치 아니 미치고 다 카페인 통고를 통화되는다 니티 준롱로라 그셔 치도 같sol라 니 쿠샤세 데 단데델라 양아소파 니마 구글랑라야 도스 지바텔라 아니 고 간타체 가린제 바이나 세티 단다 치도 같소치라 니 쿠인사이트 거로 데테 니마 구글랑라야 도스 아니 총바테 도스 맞소 티르그나 도스 바바임바이나 아니 고 초야라야다 니마 데타카랑라야 니게 니땅 아니 가 니기 추서대단 카페인이가 바로라 연대와 가르치 두세 전야라야 배야고요. 스티그 슈칭 가르치 제마테테 전야라야 펜토고요레스.
Or let's say starting at day 5, we had people start to drink caffeine before they go to bed to test the effect of caffeine, and we measured how many minutes it took for them to fall asleep.
티치나 나수델라야 니마 나와텔라야 메텔라야 아니 카페인티 통양구주 아니 카페인 틸라테네 데타 메테 니 쿠야라야 아니 카르마 카수진 고샤 사치오로와 오티달라야 체제네 고레스.
And so here we would say there's no effect of caffeine because they're not drinking caffeine. They're just kind of, this is establishing their baseline, say 1 through 4, 1 through 5.
다 단데데 가서 임번에 당보텔라야 고 나츠게 고게 망지스고라다 고게 시샤사지 베이스라인 시샤사지 등고요 바로 레스타 니마 당보뇨 심바시와 가스파르토 콜라야 쳬프레시레스테 중요 마레스티 카르세나 고게다 카페인 통메 바로 카페인 마통와라 테네데와 카페인 마통 테스탐발라 텔레 슈친 트라이오 마로와 디칼라나 가츠 시샤사게 티노지 날바고요레스.
And then here we have people start to drink caffeine, and you can see that it starts to take them a lot longer to fall asleep.
그 제라야 가수미텔라야 아니 저 카페인테 통양고주 카페인테 통양고주 스탐발레데라 카르통고도 네코 뉴크야라야 진짜 몽한 걸고요 바데데가 땡겨레스.
So this is not what this actual bar graph says, but you could imagine plotting on the y-axis or vertical axis number of minutes it took to fall asleep, and here would be day, and this type of figure would be really helpful at looking at people's data over time, over multiple days.
단단 델라야 티리치 텐샤제 되게 단단한 손레시 작요 바데 또또 땡기면도 심바나 나수 델라야 아니 그게 정트강라요 바델라야 네 니쿠야라 니누고질라 니쿠야라야 아니 그래서 다 카마네스도 가수친 거서 카마 가수친 거서 사야테 정트강라 샤 아니 트레트강라야 아니 니마세 닌가 총거서 사야지 버와 어디 지바인바이나 두시제데 다는 가지고 티르 디나로 지바바이나 가릴라 팽그레스나 저런 게 미스틱 강라야 니 딱세코 다 니마 망보가랑라 드베티기 듬디티 차야라야 아니 단다게 가지고 뒤탕드베 피르세디 아니 펜토요레스.
So this type of figure is really good for summarizing data when you have multiple observations on the same people.
다 데카리라야 펜부요레스나 아니 미스틱 강라와 미스틱 강라야 아니 지 딱세 고 니마 망보랑라야 딱세 드바이나 어디기 듬리티 차야라야 아니 데 단다기 티르시디 펜토고요레스.
Whereas a bar graph is really good when you have different groups and you're comparing group A to group B.
다 ngasulaya nerjise jora nerjise te kare yagoyoresena choranlaya dinsen mandoyo bachi ani chorange dinsen mando ani tiga baroge netante durnyuto baina ani nerjite pechotona yagoyores.
And so when you're working on your own research projects, you'll need to think about what graph is the best to use based on the type of study that you've run and the type of data that you have.
다 제주가 덕세 심지 집이 값으로와 네 저런걸라 장투지라고와 장투 때라 시샤데데 아니 티르티 관계지 배셔다나 야고도 문도 세트 제주 땡케고요레스.
It's not that one graph is better or worse than the other. It's what graph is most appropriate for the data you're trying to depict.
다 단데데 값은 가서 티르 망보지거리 티르 데이터 아니 지디 샌들에 야와다 지디 샌들에 누가 요바트네도 말이스 다 데크 조가르레스나 티르 데이터 게 쿠카스 그랬다 티르 데이터 게 아니 장투 관계지 전야라요 의심 삼바지 레도르무도 사치 거라도 인삼게 네탄텐데 시작그레스.
So what we're going to do next is switch to the idea of causation. But before we do, I want to see if anyone has any questions that they are unclear about.
다 단단가 서 지라 가리데 시작인 세나니 진리그 콜라야 데시작인 스로 네티 마제올라야 데이터 아니 저유지 단다 기지시 주로 데이터 저유지 지가 서고 맞춰야게 똑같은데 요 바이나 네 저러나스 저요
니 다소마 둔제 답장 답상 때 답장도 사오시마스
알레 강게티 코 야야 오래 can you go back to the term that coefficient correlation coefficient yeah he's not clear about that
Great.
correlation coefficient because like
So,
when we translate that into Tibetan we have a correlation that is tunde, and then a coefficient we have two terms. One is like a number that represent the coefficient, the number that represent the correlation, and then we have another term that calls dubs means like frequency, the number of frequent. So there's another term. So he's confused with the correlation coefficient.
Great. So I'm really glad that he asked because this is an important concept.
Ti twa tong ba de ni go chong chirge tanda ge nga so de tin de chen tang tap tang sa chi gor da ar tang tang sa chi gor wa de tanda ge ani de na la ya ani khu ge ji nam shang ma so ne ke chen bu chi cha ge res.
So here coefficient does not refer to frequency.
Tanda de ka sim ba de la ya dab sa chi gor wa dab sa de nga so chep di yong de ka so chi du sa chi gor wa de ta ya chi ya na nga so de she do chi yang sing se ka so chi chung du sa de chong ko ma res ta nga so chi de lo pe chi na la dab sa chi to wa de ge yang ko dab chu che ge de la ya ane de ka so nga so de tang te ta yang na de che da ko ma res.
It refers to the strength of an association between two variables.
Ta tanda de ge su ka ri chong ge se sta ba la ya jitang ni ge pa ro gi dewa chi gor wa dewa de ge shu chi le do sa de ge shu se de chong ba chi res.
The range of scores on a correlation coefficient is between -1 and +1.
Ta tanda de ka so nga so tin de chen chang de ge tang ka gi chapse ka so res na ne dog ma chi ni ngue ma chi pa ro de yo res.
If two variables were perfectly associated with each other in a positive direction, it would have an association of +1.
Ta ke ti ro ane chi jitang ni ge pa ro ge dewa de ro ane ko thum bi gi dewa yam ba ka ta ta ko thum bi gi dewa gi ngu la yo pa ba na de ge ko no ge tin de ge chen chang de ngue ma chi res.
So this would be a correlation coefficient that would be pretty close to +1.
Ta tanda de la ya pi chen sha sha ju ti ka res na ane ko ge tin de ge chen chang de chi tang ta halam than yu de res.
So as this variable goes up, this variable also goes up quite strongly.
Ta de ka ri song ko res na ro nga so de jitang chu ron jitang e de ne ji chi le do ba na jitang be de ya de nang sing ge ko ji chi la pe ge pa song ko res.
On the other side, a -1 refers to a very strong negative relationship between two variables.
Ta tinde do pe ge tinde metem be tinde imbai na kar se gor se na ko ga tang ka ni ga paro la ya ro jitang ni ga paro la ya do pin do yo pa ti song ko res do pin do ga shu chang bo yo pa song ko res.
So it's not about the frequency, it's about the strength of the association between the two variables.
Ta de ka se ba na ga chu de shu se ta cher de chung la chang ya na da ge tang ka ti chong go ma de ka su zo de ko ra ni ga paro ge reo ge ni shu chi chung ka su ji yo pa ti song ko res.
So this would be a very strong negative relationship, close to negative or -1, such that as this variable goes up, this variable is going down.
단단 되게 가르쳐나 그 도피기 딘데주로 맡은베기 딘데게 뭐데 슈 전부 청구 리스트 데캅스 바랑 속에 주장 에디와 주장 에디 페와인 바이나 주장 베디 네페 총주고 바로 데 청구 리스트.
Again, it's not so much about a frequency as much as it is about the association between the two variables.
다 데캅스 가서 대체당 지역으로 답기당데 슈 청구 말이스 데조데고 주장 니가 바로 그 대화지로 대화데 선배지레스.
So a correlation coefficient of 0 here, which is reflective of a very low relationship between two variables, doesn't depict the frequency of the variables. It depicts the fact that there's essentially no relationship between those variables.
단단 데캅스 가서 아까서 그랬고 딘데 매주가 내당되는 지인바나 그런 게 데캅스 바나 가서 딘데가 장탄데 딘데가 천장데 레코와 데캅스 콜라야 안신 주취대로 안주탄데 그 답변 가서 칠레 정도도 가마 가서 칠레 정도도 사이즈와 어때 데라야 코슈 청구 말했어 네 삼바 그 바로라야 아니 주탄데니가 바로라 주탄데가 바로라 아니 가서 그래 조시다메바 청구도스. Now I remember why we have that daptang, because when you have for instance, you have y is equal to 4x, and you call that 4 as a coefficient, right? That multiplies to.
Oh yeah,
so that's why we have that.
Yeah, that's probably why. Yeah, he's thinking of it as like a coefficient of x. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So daptang se chete chitang asu y ticket c t x la jurvi Tankatan Yam Graces Tambalayang at Shite Layang as the coefficient lagro that the Dapton Resegata, Dapton Sayati, X Laya Juriag Tanka research Gorua, what I think as we shall pressure Tanjirisha, this temple at Dicapsa, could Tom Monlola Chomachon take a netarigmua.
Yeah, so coefficients can mean different things in different contexts.
Tanangasuge, that's Sentanta Dapton say coefficient says what they go young Netamandola, young Coquamandola.
I just want to make one last point is that in science, we rarely see correlation coefficients that are really strong or really weak, really strong or really positive or really negative. Most associations are kind of moderate. So this is a 0.45. So there's kind of an association here, but it's not 1 or -1. And just to make the point that a lot of observations in science kind of are moderately strong.
That under the caps Karichi, Session system, Balaya, Tsering, Taxi caps, and a Koge, Tundrich or Rewatch or what tea, and it's on your big caps, Dawa Tibet, Hatton Shuchambu, what Tumbig Dawa, Shuchambuyopa, Digger, Chitantante, Chitan Tanu Rodan, Matumbi, Dawatian, Shuchambu, Domasitan Tanu within the Namjin Yongumadis, Yongumadis, Manchester data, Baro Parola, dance in the English, standing by the decapsung at Solaya, Chitundre, Centrante Catrado, Lecords of Shingarwa, this Tambalaya, and a cook, Ding Ding, Barog and Drawati, Centrante Ding Ding English.
Any other questions about any of the graphs that we discussed?
Or
correlation coefficients or stuff?
His question is if you have like same observation, do you have like that because tunde say don't say that chorang get tunbig tunde to topic tunde nishasigi or what? And that is tunde ko tumba to mutumba nisha shagwa. Nisha guna digwa, tumbig tunde to mutumbi tunde shishi gonna yoba tinda your ways trotira. In any case, is there any case in which both positive and negative correlations associated on single observation?
Well, I would say that within the same group of people, you will see different variables have positive or negative associations. So, for example, you know, in one group of people you're studying, some variables will be positively associated and other variables will be negatively associated. But on the exact same variable with the same people, you could get a positive or negative association over multiple measurements, but usually you would see the same direction.
Tanda di imbana ronga su kasa ta dinsen chike nana imbana yang ko ta ko tose chibe kapsu nga su len jutong ton juchiti mandwa mangpo yorwa yang tu ko dinsen chike na tose chigo re yang jutong khashila ya yang ko thumbi gi tunde ton jutong khashila ya dopi tunde yonga tunde do chi ngongres ro tinda do yores imbana chi yang chike gala ya muskare tu tose chiba imbana ko da chi junong pochila ta ba imbana jutong ga thoya ti ro chi tumba mutumba nisha topic tende nisha chikagonga tele ngomba maimbache chi khashok chikagonga dugo parwa tumba ina dopa ina topic tende ngomba chi tungres.
But I do think that this raises an issue that will start to become more prominent in the course, is the idea of replication, and that you want to see a similar direction of an association over time to really trust that observation.
Ta tanda di la tende tanga suga rimshinta di tongore chikar sana nga suga takshish mjik chi istambala ya di chet drip niwa ichi imbachi ngorwa istambala ya di kapsu karchigo sana choranga takshish chi re di yangsi dripa imbayna chorangi ngola tongsha juga drimdi di tang dawu chigita ko 통구 여러 가지 지금 생각이 통구 요소가 막 일단 자오치 통바 임바나 아니 거기 다 터세신 주지와 땅 가지고 루페요 빠진 거와 데스tambalaya 카쇼 찔라야 도와치 도스통그레스.
So if on one day you see a positive association between two variables in a group of people, but then on the next day it's all of a sudden a negative association, something's mysterious there, and it may mean that those associations are not very reliable.
Picha baina ro tirin charong mi dinsin chila ya tse de pickups kurange tunde te tumbege tunde chuchambu yobachi chor ani sanye yanche tse chion stambala ya mutumbege tunde chuchambu yobachi sorba imbaina da tege parotela ya netan kense chichon yo restin stambala ya ani ko tege taship tantezo karsugrata matsuga lehte chukpa memba ro lehte michwa chimba tege netan de ngongo res.
Is there any one last question that somebody might have before we take a break?
The person madam wala ya troy jemba chi tane ayos.
Mage group kewa.
The jerchu tang jetang tang jerchu yora. Ani koni gan jia me pate kan thiri sira tin son grace. Tesrate tanda satang tang chawa tang chongwa chi yora. 차야랑 파랑도 정원용도 들어와 당 정화야랑 파랑도 차원용도 들어와 어때라 가르는 제정던 제춘이가 저함에 파스 거래 제정던 제춘이야 파데 트리 건거 중그레스 트리 컨디션 중그레스
다 데가서 같은 제정던 제추사 시가 고고요다 와
제철 페나니 가르는 더사지요라
네네
어때
this which I'm saying is sonda
더지요라 차와당 정화 페나 차와타와 야랑 파라요나 정화타와 니가 말한 접이 용거라
네네
언접이 용도 가르는 탐 트리 너리 라 진도 그리나 그래 어디 가르제나 아니 제정당 제친이가 저함에 파연 송거리 랍송 어때 컨디션 송이요레스
Ale want to have a plot that no correlation plot. Can you bring that slide up? Of yes, that no correlation slide. His question is like how this is represented. For instance, like his example is his said the hotness and coldness is like a negative correlation, and one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So So his question is how is that no correlation presented on the plot?
Well, that would be an example of a strong negative correlation.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you know, in that scenario, as hot goes up, cold goes down. That would be an example of a negative correlation. But there are some variables in life that just are not related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are many that are. So I think his example is one that would be a negative correlation. As heat goes up, you know, cold goes down and vice versa.
Again, like so I so Dawa tang Cawa say or Cawa tang Dawa de and it topic to the Yapu Soyaji Yoris Instambalaya Chi Pewa Manager the Yongrua. But there is that 20 messages Tambalaya as in Japan you parola, Japan you parola yoko, Dawachuni Zumut in the rollers on Yoris.
So like to kind of think of negative or no correlation, let's say as heat goes up in the year in India, that's not going to associate with height going up or down. There's no association, right? So it's just there are many variables that just are not related to each other at all, and that would be depicted in an absence of a correlation. But heat and cold would be a series of variables that are very related.
Mm-hmm. You mean heat going up and height? Did you say height?
Yeah, so I'm using that as kind of an absurd example of there's no association between it. So there's no association between, you know, the temperature in the room and how tall you are.
Yeah.
But there is an association between the temperature in the room and cold. So just to kind of make the case.
Sure. There shakarsa the pisha shapana so tangi gelagi pe soya 지금 차왔던 정화세야 되도 그 도피기 된데 시청부 요바치레스 찬성라야 가서 그 지금 주와다 아니 zupu그랑 치어요르사 지워라다 zupu그랑 세다 아니 차트게 니tonte keche stambal에 니고 바로라 촌에 조촌에 메치드네로 요레스.
So we're out of time for the morning session, or for the first morning session. One of the ideas that maybe we'll return to next week is the idea of causation, because I think that it's very interesting to think about the differences between correlation and causation. So we may come back to this if we have more time, but my view is that it's helpful to spend some time getting familiar with these graphs because very quickly they're going to be important for depicting your own data in your research projects. And if anything's unclear about these graphs, don't worry, because we're going to spend a lot of time helping you make the graphs, interpret the graphs, and work with the graphs. So this is just meant to be a general introduction. So let's take a break. We'll see you in 30 minutes and we'll continue on. Thank you so much.
Tadanda ngaso person chilangins person language la ane karma sumchi jilangayons ane tadadegi deshi jagara chische tadanga sudi oroka sen jirche tan jirtran saide chiba koya chiro karchlana sansama ngaso ge variable system ba kusu kwa mabo variable system sansama tanga koya tinda ore sijikayo stamba tanga reyo variable emotion ro tanga so samyon ro tumuda dichi ro jiro tanga tinda ro de stamba le ko tanga marwa this stamba chechu chungwe tanga so de la ya 산서만 주통세 페이지 당거 산서만 주치세 페이지 당거로 그냥 잠깐 메시지라 인 주통 페이지 도서네 캔슬도가 스타발라인 주치세네 체추성 거다 디치세도 또 곰니 그래서 곰자 마제세지어와 스타발라야 대용 고샤나 대 가서 측에 니어 버게 준선들이로 스타발라야 고 그냥 다텔로 고야 되는 말에 집어 시청래